This is the first video on information, and we're really going to be talking about asymmetric information. When our market assumption of full information gets broken, like when you go to buy a car and you don't know as much about it as you would like. There's not full information on everyone's price and everyone's quality, importantly. And then what if your boss or your professor doesn't have information on your quality, your effort? And this is going to be the difference between our two big concepts this chapter. Moral hazard over here and adverse selection over here. We'll be talking about those two concepts in this first video. And you're going to love chapter 10, no graphs, no math, just intuition. So for all of these, you should just be able to define the terms and think of examples or apply them to a specific situation that I give you. So this chapter is all about what happens when our assumption of full information is violated, when customers or when sellers do not have full information about quality, actions, prices, etc. So we're going to define that as asymmetric information. Asymmetric, meaning not symmetrical, not the same, is when one party in a transaction knows more. And for example, what if sellers know more about quality than buyers? That would violate our full information assumption that we made going back to markets module. What if workers know more about their effort than their bosses? So I want you to just pause, and before we get too deep in this, think about the last time you engaged in a transaction or a relationship where you knew more than the other party involved, and just briefly describe that to me. It's the last time that you had asymmetric information, where you knew more. Just pause and answer. Okay, looking forward to hearing some of your examples. Our first type of asymmetric information is adverse selection. Sometimes I'll abbreviate it AS because I like to abbreviate things. And the two big characteristics of adverse selection is that it happens before the transaction. So before you enter into the insurance contract, before you buy the good off of eBay, before you enter into the relationship, before you elect the politician. There's a problem of hidden type. So it's not actions that are hidden, like in our next type of asymmetric information, it's type that is hidden. So one party, usually the seller, but not always. For insurance in particular, it will be the customer that knows more. But usually the seller knows more about the quality or the risk or the attributes, any piece of the type of the product or service that's being traded. But you can also apply adverse selection to relationships and politics. And in those categories, it's not really a product or service that's being traded, service being your love or your elected officials' responsibility to you. It's more of a person that's being traded. So we can apply this pretty broadly, but it's a problem of hidden type that happens before the trade. Why is this a problem? Why does it matter? What's the big deal if one person knows more? The first application of this concept was to the used car market. And George Akerlof wrote a very famous paper back in the 70s called The Problem with Lemons. So I want you to just think this through before I tell you my take on it. So here's the sad little cherry car that knows it's good, but it's surrounded by bad cars, which are called lemons. Why is this bad for that little cherry car? So just pause and take this quiz. Think through what would happen because the sellers of the used cars know a lot more about their quality than the potential buyers. Just briefly pause and take that multiple choice quiz. It's going to be all of the above, right? Adverse selection is going to shrink the market. Because buyers cannot tell true quality, and I've bought many used cars, and every time I know it's a gamble, because I'm usually buying it off of Craigslist, not from a dealer. Because I know it's a gamble, and there's a probability that the car is a lemon, a piece of junk, my demand is lower than it would be. My willingness to pay is lower at every price. I said no graphs. This graph is not mandatory, but it might help. This is what my asymmetric information does. It shifts my demand down, which is going to shift the price down. And at lower prices, this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because I think all the cars are crappy, they all become crappy. Because at a lower price, all of these sellers leave the market. The ones who are willing to sell their car for higher leave because they know their car is pretty good. They have a high opportunity cost of selling it to me. They know they could keep it themselves and it would probably run for 5 more years. They could pass it on to their teens in 3 years. I don't know what their alternative is. But at lower prices, those peaches, remember this is the opposite of a lemon, in his paper it's a peach, get crowded out of the market. And we're left with just these lemons down here who are actually worse quality. The average car is worse quality because of the buyer's reservations about paying a high price. So the only items left are those of lower quality. So if you know your used car is high quality, but you can't prove it, what are your alternatives? You're going to leave the market. Maybe you just donate the car. You say, oh, it's not even worth my time to hassle with trying to find a buyer. I know they're just going to try and bargain me down because they don't have enough information. Maybe you pass it on to your teenagers, like I said. There's not a ton of alternatives, but there are ways you can leave the market. Maybe you just let it rust in your front yard. That's the big problem with adverse selection that you should be able to grasp, is that the big deal is that we get all this dead weight loss, that the market is smaller than it should be, right? All of this is mutually beneficial transactions that don't take place. Consumers and producers are worse off because the market shrinks. There are many more examples of adverse selection. So you should be able to come up with a few of your own, but an example is who to date. So it's before the transaction, the potential suitors type is hidden from you. Which clothes to buy on eBay. Shopping online is full of adverse selection. We know a lot less about the quality of the clothes than the people selling them and making them. Who to insure, who to give insurance to. Before the transaction, the person looking for insurance knows a lot more about their risk than the insurance company. And the insurance company also knows a lot more about the policy, but the buyer can look that up online, right? All the fine print is available. Which professor to take. Before you register for classes, professors know a lot more about the structure of the class, about their expectations than you do. So take one of these 4 examples, or if you have a really great one, use that one, and think about how the issue gets resolved in the real world. That's where we're going with the second video. I want you to start brainstorming, how do we get around adverse selection? Because we do carry forth with all of these types of transactions, despite our missing information. What mechanisms have we developed to help us make transactions even when we don't have perfect information? Our second type of asymmetric information is called moral hazard. And the difference between moral hazard and adverse selection is moral hazard happens after the transaction. So after you've bought the good, after you've hired the person, after you're in the relationship, after you have insurance. And it's not a problem of hidden type, it's a problem of hidden action, where one party knows more about the actions they're taking. So this is also called the principal-agent problem. And in that framework, it's the principal who hires the agent, and the agent usually has more information. Autocorrect got me. Principle, not like a fundamental truth. Principle, like a principal at school. So this diagram is showing that. So the principal is acting in their own self-interest, and the agent is acting in their own self-interest, right? They're both rational humans trying to maximize their utility, but the principal needs a job done. So they hire the agent, and the agent is going to perform. The easiest application of this is the workplace. When you hire somebody to fix your car, when you hire someone to nanny your child. But it also applies to politics. So in your problem set, I'm going to have you apply it to the presidential election. Who's the principal and who's the agent in politics? It also applies kind of to relationships. Not that one person is in the relationship as principal and the other is the agent, hopefully. Hopefully there's some balance there. But you are both kind of hiring each other to provide for each other's emotional needs. And you're going to act in your own self-interest in that equation and have some hidden action that could potentially undermine the relationship. So what's the problem, right? You hire someone to do something, they have a lot of hidden actions, so it's usually the agent that knows more. What's this going to cause? My dad's all-time favorite cartoon is Dilbert. So if you want to, you can just pause the video and read these Dilbert cartoons. But I feel like Dilbert is all about moral hazard. It's all about like the grind of office workers trying to eke out some, well, it's always a little bit depressing and bleak, but it's always these office workers trying to kind of like cut corners on the big corporate structure. Why is this a problem? So why is it a problem that this boss can't trust their employee to always be working for the company's best interests instead of their own self-interest? Well, the big problem is that you're going to waste resources monitoring people. So one solution to moral hazard is monitoring and enforcement. So you just install lots of cameras and make sure your employees are working. I worked at a coffee shop once where the boss had a hidden, it wasn't even a hidden camera. He just had a camera that he would watch us on and then call us if he wanted to talk to us about what we were doing. It was very lovely. So you're going to waste resources monitoring people. You're going to lose good employees who don't like being monitored. I left eventually. Or moral hazard is going to shrink the market just like adverse selection would. So because principals cannot perfectly observe the actions of their agents, their demand falls for workers. This becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy once again. There's going to be lower market prices, usually lower wages, because again, we're usually talking about moral hazard in an employment framework. The only agents willing to participate in the market once the wage is low are those of much lower effort and lower quality. People who have a low opportunity cost, who don't have a lot of outside alternatives. That makes sense? So if you think about this, if you know you're working hard, but you can't really prove it, you're going to not want to participate in that market. You're going to try and find another market where you get paid more. Maybe because it's easier to prove that you're working hard. So a lot of the gig economy and the way that workers are making money in their side gigs is like, it's easy to prove if you're a good Uber driver or not because of the 5-star rating system or because of the number of rides and the amount of revenue you bring in for the company. There are a lot of jobs where it might be harder to prove you're a good worker and therefore pay you a lower wage than something pretty transparent like Uber or Lyft. Does that make sense? So there are going to be places where because bosses can't observe you, because voters can't perfectly observe you, they're willing to pay less for your services. And that is going to discourage people who know they would put in higher effort and make them seek markets where there is more transparency and less moral hazard. Okay, so more examples of moral hazard. There are many, many of these. So after the transaction, after the marriage, one spouse knows more about their extramarital activities than the other. They both have some asymmetric information about their own activities. You hire a nanny and the nanny knows more about what they're doing. Maybe they're on their phone all day. Maybe after the exam, maybe the exam is our transaction. I know more about how I'm grading you. I'm gonna try and make it pretty transparent so you know about as much as I do. After you buy the clothes on eBay, will the seller actually ship them? Will they just take your money? After you insure a customer, will they take more risks? So this is what moral hazard is about. After the transaction, hidden action. Okay, so I want you to pick, just like you did for moral hazard, pick one of the above or your own example if you really want to do your own example of moral hazard, and think about how it gets resolved in the real world. So just pause and answer that. And that's actually the end of the video. I'm going to talk to you kind of broadly in definition terms with some examples about how it gets solved. But I want you to be brainstorming before you watch that video.